Oh, I realize I can't compete either with the bar or with the person next to you, but here I am to say good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Allgard, and it is my honor to welcome you to the Massachusetts Historical Society and to Empire and Its Discontent, 1763 to 1773. This conference is a collaboration between the MHS and the David Center at the American Philosophical Society. Thank you, David Center and APS. You know, especially in this time where we're getting ready to commemorate the 250th anniversary of events leading up to the American Revolution, it's nice when Philadelphia and Boston can work together. But after tonight, the rivalry is still on. And of course, I have to say that the commemoration has just started here in Boston as the town is gearing up for our Tea Party anniversary in a few weeks. So what better moment then to examine the state of the empire in 1763 and its fall from grace, if I may invoke the Puritans, and I think I may, in 1773 as its upstart colonies began to challenge the imperial order. Before we get started, let me add that I said that I was honored to be here. You honor the MHS by being here. We so appreciate your willingness to show up in person and across the airways and share the fruits of your research. Supporting your work through fellowships, seminars, venues, and opportunities like this one now and throughout your careers is our commitment and our passion. But the gratitude goes deeper, I think. Thank you for dedicating your intellectual lives and various considerable talents to the work of history. Your research shapes the way we think of the past and how we all consider as Americans the present and the future, and we at the MHS are here to help. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote and our panel, and I'd like to start with Serena Zbin. She's a professor of history at Carleton College. She recently was in my shoes as a lady presidentess, as we used to say, as president of SHEAR, and she helped the MHS with our Boston Massacre exhibit and is the author of, most recently, The Boston Massacre, A Family History. An award-winning historian of the British and British Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries, Christopher Brown is professor of history at Columbia University. He is the author of Moral Capital, Foundations of British Abolitionism, and co-editor of Arming Slaves, From Classical Times to the Modern Era. We have Patrick Griffin with us, who is the Madden Hennerby Family Professor, as well as the Thomas More and Judy Livingston Director of the Keogh Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame. His most recent book is The Age of Atlantic Revolution, The Rise and Fall of a Connected World. They will be moderated, to the degree that this group can be moderated, by Brendan J. McConville, who is the professor of history at Boston University, our neighbor. He is the author most recently of The Brethren, A Story of Faith and Conspiracy in Revolutionary America. He is a long-standing member of our MHS community and serves on the steering committee for the Pauline Maier Early American History Seminar, and he is currently the head of the David Center for the American Revolution at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome, everybody.
I'd like to first thank MHS for being really an ideal partner for this conference with the David Center and the APS. Oh, not on? Oh, we got to get closer. Okay. How's that? Better? Better? Still can't hear me. Closer? How's that? Better? Okay. I want to thank the MHS for being really an ideal partner for the David Center and the APS in creating the conference. They really have been fabulous. I particularly want to thank Kit and Cassie here at MHS and Adriana Link and Thomas Johns at the APS. They really have made the conference happen. They do fabulous work in programming, and we really wouldn't be here without them, literally. I also want to thank Kate Grangine of Wellesley College and Pat Sparrow of Mount Vernon. They served on the program committee with me, and they really, put in a lot of time trying to shape the conference and make it a lively event. The conference, as we've all noted, is in part time to mark the 250th anniversary of the Tea Party and generally the appearance of these 250th anniversaries that lead to American independence and then lead beyond into the war and into the constitutional crisis. And to approach these anniversaries, I think it's encouraged all of us who are at the conference, particularly the panelists, to sort of reconsider and think a little bit more about the late empire and its issues and its nature and its problems. And so we formed the keynote not in the traditional way of having just a keynote speaker and then having someone. We instead wanted to form it as a panel so that we would hear sort of different views in a kind of smaller, shorter sort of discussion about what people think was happening in this period between 1763 and 1773, what was going on, and sort of how did it all fit together, and why did it all lead to revolution? And I think that the thrust of all this, you know, when we talked about it, I just said, let's talk about it a little bit, and everyone will talk for maybe 10 minutes about what their views are about sort of this big central question: could the empire have been saved? What was the nature of the empire? What were the nature of its problems, and were they, you know, irredeemable, or were they in fact just contingent on the behaviors of, you know, the people who were involved in a sense? And so I just think that starting with those big questions, it seems like a really simple question. Could the empire have been saved, or was the revolution inevitable? They're pretty basic sounding questions that demand super complex answers, I think. But I think just starting out and having that discussion gives us the opportunity as a community of scholars to begin this sort of general reconsideration of the revolution and its origins, its meaning, that we kind of hope will be an ongoing discussion. So with that, and having said that, I'm going to turn to Serena and just ask that question: could the empire have been saved? What kind of empire was it? Was the revolution inevitable? Was it really a crisis until almost the outbreak of fighting, or was it, what was driving it? What was not driving it? And start there.
Thank you, Brendan. I won't repeat all the thanks, but I do want to thank the program committee for inviting me to be a part of this really impressive panel. And I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm so thrilled to be back at MHS, which is the site of some of my happiest academic moments. So when I was asked to think about the question, could the empire be saved, I have to admit the only place my mind went was to the Ladies' Home Journal. Can this marriage be saved? Yes? Right, see? And for those of you who somehow are not going to admit to this log, a guilty pleasure, you know, this was this crazy and the most popular advice column in America, right? Started in the 1950s. Super terrible. Talk about that in a little bit, but it turns out that actually that is a kind of helpful frame, I think, for imagining some of these big questions. We're going to get into some really granular and important discussions about what did the empire look like in its last moments that it didn't know was its last moments, right? There's so much fabulous scholarship I'm so excited for, both talking about tomorrow and the session we've already heard. So I'm going to take this up to 30,000 feet and think a little bit about this question, right? Like, could the empire have been saved? Can this empire be saved? And I like thinking about it. I find it helpful to think about this as a relationship gone wrong, right? So as many of you know, elsewhere I wrote about, you know, just the moment of the Boston Massacre, or at least of its aftermath, as, you know, a bad divorce. But I think that there are so many moments when things might have turned, right? When things might have gone differently, which is why this question is so important, and we keep asking over and over again, right? What might have been different? Where are the contingent moments that many of you are pointing to? And I think many historians have recently, you know, noticed that, you know, one of the things that happens is both both sides escalate, right? There are kind of incommensurate responses to various moments, whether those are things that people write or things that people say. And to me, that also seems not that unlike many human relationships. And that metaphor of marriage makes the revolution itself, I think, feel more human, both in scale and in emotion. And it's worth our thinking that there are, of course, absolutely enormous factors that are far larger than any person that shape this 18th century world, right? We could point, and it's our job as historians to recognize these, right? Things that are bigger than just any one individual. We might think about, the acceleration of the slave trade in this moment, right? Or, I think there's a lot of papers on increased pressure on indigenous land. I mean, lots of big factors. And so I'd like us to stop for just a moment and think about something that's really shifted for free women in the 18th century, because I think it's worth it for us to just spend a moment thinking about what marriage actually was in the 1760s and 1770s. So here at the MHS, I think I should, of course, acknowledge Abigail Adams's call, right, to remember the ladies, but even more, I think, to remember Ruth Bloch's reminder that Abigail Adams is talking in this moment about wife beating, right? That's really what she's looking at. And so, as an aside, I will say there is a shocking amount of victim blaming in the wife beating accounts in the Ladies' Home Journal from the 1950s that I'm still trying to sort of bleach from my brain, having done that 15 minutes of research. Sorry, there I digress. But when we think about marriage as part of the American Revolution, I do think it's worth remembering that the 18th century's view of heterosexual marriage, and especially of coverture, was being invented, right, in this very moment of the imperial crisis. So William Blackstone, right, he only famously publishes his definition of coverture in the 1760s. And of course, for a long time, we know historians have misunderstood Blackstone's writings on coverture, right? We've kind of accepted his framing of this as a long-standing and uncontested vision of patriarchy, rather than the active attempt that jurist was making to shift more power to all men, right? To masters, to fathers, and to husbands, because coverture in the 1760s was a claim, right? It's not a practice. And so let me just suggest here, I'm just floating this idea, that as free men across the British Empire were claiming increased power over their households, right? The people that they enslaved, the children they fathered, the women they married, that question of power and control became particularly salient to them. So if we move back to that metaphor of marriage, like lots of conflicts, right, domestic and diplomatic, sometimes people react in ways that are incommensurate to the actual insult. I hope my husband's not watching this live stream. But perhaps then, might suggest, that political men, shall make me laugh, political men on both sides of the Atlantic overreacted because they were already working so hard to establish their own power in their own sites, right? In their own households, in their own worlds, that this question of what does it mean to claim authority is something that is live and that is personal and that actually should not be invisible to us. Thank you.
That's great.
So could I just ask you one question? Taking which I thought was a really fascinating take on this question, are you then arguing in a general sense that the imperial crisis intersects with or causes, is it one or the other, or both, a crisis of patriarchal authority?
No, I think that the crisis of patriarchal authority precedes and is larger than the imperial crisis. But I think that it would be worth exploring, at least, to the idea that the imperial crisis becomes a political crisis, in part because so many of the political actors are already thinking about the problems of authority.
Right. It intersects with it. It's an intersection of the crisis with a deeper crisis that had been more ongoing.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to turn to Pat, and I want to ask the same question, basically, which is, could the empire have been saved? And I think as a related question, was anything inevitable in this period?
So when Professor McConville put this question to me, I didn't think about marriage like the way Serena's did. I thought about something else. I thought about Saturday Night Live. Okay, and if you're old enough to remember this, in 1978 there was this terrible skit that was called What If? Okay, so just imagine this for a moment. Jane Curtin gets up and she says, today we have What If? And the question we're going to deal with today is, what if Napoleon had a B-52 at Waterloo? What would it have been like? And in this skit then, John Belushi is playing Napoleon, and then you have Dan Aykroyd is playing this Slim Pickens kind of character from Dr. Strangelove who's going to be dropping the bomb on the British forces at Waterloo. And after this happens, and after the bomb is dropped, then Bill Murray is a military analyst coming in and seriously saying we'd all be parlez-vous in France saying if that bomb would have been dropped, if they would have had the B-52. Now, I say this because, you know, this is the dreaded counterfactual. And this is the one question historians don't want to answer. It gives us hives. As I think Professor Shankman's advisor once put it, this is the sort of thing that should embarrass the historian or terrify the historian as they try to address that question. Okay, but that being said, I think it is important for just the second question that Professor McConville asked, and that's the one about inevitability. And I think particularly for we who happen to be from the United States, because no matter how we cut it, anyway, we find ourselves caught up in this inexorable litany that begins in 1765 almost like a drumbeat. So we go Stamp Act crisis, Townsend duties, then we have the massacre, then you have eventually the Tea Party, then you're going to have shots ringing out, then you're going to have a Declaration of Independence and some other things sprinkled in there as well. But we start marching inevitably toward revolution, and that seems to be sort of the story, and that's difficult for us to push back against, and that's where the counterfactual, the what if, for us is really helpful. And I want to address it from really three different perspectives today: the British perspective, the Atlantic perspective, then briefly looking at the perspective from the provinces, the American perspective. So the British perspective. Actually, a lot of historians, really good historians, have asked this question. And they've asked it just for this particular kind of reason. And basically, almost all of them have come up with, you know what, the range of available options are really quite narrow. Pretty much, there was a debate that was certainly going on in the British Parliament in the 1760s about what to do with America. That's for certain. But ultimately, all of them pretty much agreed that parliamentary sovereignty was going to be it. And in some way, shape, or form, the colonies were going to have to be subordinated. And actually, the choices they had was not a great range of choices. And so, almost inevitably, one way or another, sooner or later, the crisis was inevitably going to come. The rift was going to come. But there's some fascinating things we can talk about. We've heard one in the first panel today. Suppose Lord Rockingham's administration had gone on longer. Would that have allowed for kind of some healing of these divisions? I think the second one is actually probably more probable, and that is the Chatham administration. So William Pitt, of course, has become what we'd call prime minister in 1766. When he's then elevated to Lord Chatham, and you have the Chatham administration. Okay, this is a guy who certainly believed in parliamentary sovereignty, but he's also someone who believed that the idea of consent had to be at the heart of it. As he famously put it, we can't treat our American brethren like bastards. They have to be treated a certain kind of way. But he's incapacitated with gout, he's having emotional problems, and so he can't more or less kind of take the reins of government. On the other hand, you could say that if he had been able to take the reins of government, maybe he would have been more of a hardliner, because more often than not, those people who did go into government become hardliners, even if they had been more liberally oriented before. And so ultimately, when I look from the British angle, probably the best we can come up is, I don't know. I don't know. Who knows? How about from the Atlantic perspective? You know, of course, the British weren't the only ones that were trying to kind of rein in colonies and figure things out. The 7 Years' War was a moment for all imperial powers, and it's because the Atlantic had been transformed over the course of the 18th century, and the 7 Years' War was the apogee of that dynamic. And the war was fought on a scale that no one had ever seen before. History's First World War, with armies that are larger, armies in the field for longer periods of time, conflicts that are much, much more intense than they had been in the past. The stakes in the Atlantic had become enormously, enormously high. And after this war ended, all powers start to reform. And when we think about that litany that I mentioned before, that's actually just a reform movement. Mm-hmm. It's not the idea we have to stem the chain, we have to kind of stem the commerce of the Atlantic, or we have to kind of stymie what those Americans are doing, but the state has to harness it because of the heightened stakes in the Atlantic at this particular moment. The French are going to try to do it. The Spanish are going to try to do it. The Portuguese are going to try to do it. Actually, some of them have more, if you will, comprehensive plans for reform than the British do. That's for sure. Those three powers that are really hamstrung by the 7 Years' War, two of them are going to be on the losing side. One is going to be really in a difficult position, Portugal, after the 7 Years' War because of the Lisbon earthquake, but also because of fighting in Latin America. They're all going to try to do reform, but they're all going to fail at it. And ultimately what's going to happen, ironically, is the hands of Creole elites in parts of their empire, like in Saint-Domingue for the French, in much of Spanish America for the Spanish, and in Brazil especially for the Portuguese, the hands of these people are going to be strengthened, not weakened. And so ultimately the losers of that war win when it comes to reform. The British are the only ones who are able to push it through in some kind of comprehensive fashion. And that, I think, to a certain extent, is the curse of winning. That, if you will, by winning the war, there was so much more for them that was at stake. By winning the war, they had the capacity to believe that they could initiate reforms that they could follow through on. They had just enough power, the conceit of power, to think that they could actually transform a space, the Atlantic, into an imperial system. But of course they failed. Could they have gone the other route? Could they have done what the others did? The second answer, when I look at this perspective, who knows? Who knows? And finally, the American perspective. The Americans' perspective, of course, if the British would have relented, I would think that we'd all still have British passports today. You know, I think that's pretty much a given. Jack Rakoff there is squinting. I think he doubts it to a certain extent, okay? But where we find those places where people in the center left the provincials well enough alone, for the most part, you did not find independence movements. The Americans had a couple of advantages. They had distance from the British. They also didn't have fear on their side. The fact that the French are gone, the fact that the Spanish are gone from Florida, that makes a bit of a difference for them to stand up. But all provincials always push back against reform measures. That's an absolute given. For me, the interesting thing about the American angle is the question that Professor McConville posed to us, and that is the one about inevitability. Because the question isn't for us to see, like, when inevitabilities occur. It's when the people on the ground thought that things were inevitable. And it's because of the fact that one measure is being passed over another that what you find is that Americans actually themselves create a pattern of inevitability in the years before the Declaration of Independence. And I think, you know, we have Mary Beth Norton here, who, of course, it says the year 1774 is a really, really critical year when you start to see the minds of people turning inexorably to something. Does that mean that it was inevitable then? To them it was, almost. To them it was. And ironically, too, what you find out is that so many of American provincials are asking themselves the what-if question. So studying this in a book that I did before, I found that Americans were transfixed with the idea of the counterfactual as they were dealing with their own inevitabilities. When they knit together patterns of inexorability, they began to ask the question, what if? But ultimately, what from the American angle do we learn? Who knows? Now, you came to me, I know, for an answer, and so let me finally give you one after all this waffling. Yes, if George III would have had a fleet of B-52s, the empire could have been saved. Thank you.
Could I just redirect one question to Patrick before we go to Chris? Do you think at the beginning of your remarks, when you said, you sort of listed these things, how we discussed them, do you think that they really think it's a crisis before 1773, the end of 1773, throughout the empire? Look, they've got problems of imperial governance, which we would all acknowledge, but is it a crisis in the way that we think of that term, the imperial crisis?
Yeah, I think, going back to Professor Norton's work, I would say 1774 is going to be the key breaking point. And that's a key breaking point, I think, because by that point, Americans believe they're past the point of no return. I would argue before 1774, they are already basically saying that we are in crisis. And they say this because largely they're saying that it's clear at this particular point of time by the patterning that they're doing that Parliament is out to subordinate us, and that's all there is to it. And the next thing that's going to happen, even something seemingly as innocuous as the Tea Act, that's the proof positive, is going to set them off. Anything would have set them off.
Interesting. So I want to turn to Chris now and ask that same question. Could the empire have been saved? And I also want to ask whether he thinks that the empire there was a general crisis in the empire that extended beyond the British America-London relationship. That, in other words, a general crisis through the empire.
Yeah, boy. First of all, it's just wonderful to be up here with the three of you. And if I had had more room on my sheet, I would have had more extensive notes. I mean, this has been such two wonderful responses. And when I was asked to be part of this panel and I was told that the question was, could the empire have survived? There was no way I could refuse that invitation because it's such an interesting question. But it's also a question with a number of premises embedded in it. And maybe it's a sort of instinct towards being contrary. Maybe it's coming slightly from outside the sort of the chronological story of the American Revolution. But the thing that I just keep coming back to is the empire was fine. Even after 1783, the empire was fine. There was a lot more British Empire in 1876 than there had been in 1776. You look to South Africa, you look to Australia, you look to the growing influence in Latin America, certainly Britain's power in Europe in the 19th century. The empire was fine. So the whole question of whether the empire could have been saved is to suggest that it needed saving. Now, I understand that it's a question that's coming out of a North American context, but I think the answer for why it wasn't saved requires some attention to the mindsets on the other side of the Atlantic about the relative importance and role of North America in the broader sweep of British overseas enterprise. Right? I mean, 13 colonies are super important to us, but Americans have a tendency sometimes to exaggerate their own importance, and and that's true even in the 18th century. And one sign of this is that, and I've written about this a little bit, there certainly was a crisis of confidence, a real disappointment and sense of dishonor in the loss of the 13 colonies, but it's pretty striking how quickly that disappears. And it was this session that led me to think about this. I don't think there's a nostalgia, I don't think there's a literature of nostalgia in Britain in the first half of the 19th century about the lost American empire. Right? I mean, I don't think there's a kind of a sort of the world we've lost or the order that fell. Right? I mean, the Loyalists miss it, and increasingly some of the Federalists miss it. But I'm not sure anybody in Britain misses North America once they get over the fact that they kind of lost a war that they weren't supposed to lose. So this gets to my second response to the question, and I'm answering the question by dodging it, which is whether Britain actually needed the empire. Did it actually need the North American empire? And it's not clear to me that the answer to that is yes either. In the first half of the 19th century, the United States, although we don't like to think about it this way, is part of Britain's informal empire, at least from an economic perspective. Right? All of the manufactured goods that are being purchased out of the warehouses and factories and industries in Britain, all of the raw goods, cotton we know, obviously, but there are many others, right? The economic relationship thrives after American independence, with the advantage of not having to actually govern or maintain an army or convince people to submit. So it's not clear to me that Britain didn't come out better in some ways with respect to at least the economic impact. And certainly there's all kinds of diplomatic and cultural influences that remain. So this gets to my third response, the question of whether the empire could have been saved. I know there was a war and tens of thousands have died during that conflict, but how seriously did Britain actually try to win this war? I mean, they tried to shut down a rebellion, and they did want to win, especially up until 1778 when France joined, then it becomes a whole nother deal. But again, there are ways at times that Britain fights this as if it's a kind of a law enforcement operation rather than a full-scale war. We're going to conquer the 13 colonies. And so if it's a war that's a war but not actually a war to the death, again, the sense of the priority, and especially once France enters the war, as we all know, the Caribbean becomes the priority. And if the question is never exactly the question, but if the question is 13 colonies or Jamaica, that's an easy one. Right? So the question of did Britain try to save the empire? Yes, but how hard exactly? And that gets to my fourth response, which is to point out that there were a number of people who were ignored in the 1760s and 1770s that this is not an empire worth saving. I think of John Cartwright, I think of Josiah Tucker, I think even in Edmund Burke, some instances, some of the things that he had to say. If they want to be independent, let them go. They could foresee in some ways what would happen in the first half of the 19th century, which is that the economic relationships and the cultural influence would remain even if the power didn't. Josiah Tucker said Britain should actually declare independence from the 13 colonies. Because their notions of, liberty, the way they're defining liberty is going to pull down the order, the established political order in Britain. They're a bad influence. And then I guess the last thing I would say in dodging the question, could the empire have been saved, is that American independence actually saved the British Empire in one particular way. It showed them what not to do. Britain handles its settler colonies in an entirely different way after American independence. Where the pattern in the 19th century is to grant increasing autonomy. Andrew Shankman made this point earlier, and it's absolutely right. So that self-governance in those places where there's a significant British settlement is the way to retain power, rather than an attempt to control those settlers. So, and just to close, I mean, the best example of this, most of you will know that Britain accomplished emancipation in 1833, 1834 by buying out slaveholders in the British Caribbean to the tune of 20 million pounds. They provided reparations to the slaveholders. What's not often recognized is that that legislation was an authorization by Parliament to pay the owners of slaves in the British Caribbean once their own assemblies passed emancipation acts. They essentially bribed the colonial assemblies in the British Caribbean into emancipating their slaves. They didn't emancipate just by fiat from Britain, because they accepted the principle, even though obviously it's a very strong stick, and there wasn't a possibility of an American revolt in the British Caribbean the way that there had been in North America. But even in this moment of assertion of imperial power, in 1833-34, they were honoring the principle of self-governance by saying, you're going to emancipate them, and we're going to pay you for it. So the empire was doing fine as far as I'm concerned.
I just want to redirect one question to Chris, and then I want to make a couple general questions or comments. But why did they take the course? In other words, why did they get so upset? Why didn't they choose a different path, or simply concede on some things, which they could have kept all their commercial control? Why didn't they go that route?
I mean, in some ways, I think Serena and Patrick are better positioned to answer that question than I am. But, you know, my gut response is just the human nature of it. You know, when you understand yourself to be in a position of authority, you understand that Parliament is sovereign. When you understand that these are colonies with colonists, the idea that you're just going to let them do what they want to do, even if it's in your best interest, is not, even if you can make the point, and I'm not sure anybody fully believed that it could be in Britain's economic interest to establish a kind of a grand league of sovereign states in the way that John Cartwright was talking about. That requires a surrender of pride and honor and sense of position that goes to, you know, some of the qualities that Serena's talking about, which is that, you know, power has its own attractions. Being in power has its own attractions, regardless of whether you're actually, what you do with it, right? So, I mean, that's a very broad, abstract answer. But I do think that the British government, and I'm really sort of treading on Patrick's territory here, but I really do think that the British government just has a really difficult time imagining the world that's going to emerge in the 19th century. And to be fair, they don't know that there's going to be a French Revolution and a series of Napoleonic Wars that's going to leave Britain as the only power in Europe significantly in the 19th century. I mean, they don't know that. But that is, in fact, how it turns out.
Yeah. I did want to ask a question which came to mind during the panel, but had been, you know, in my mind when we were thinking about it this week, which is the term ideology has not been used yet in the conference, and it's not really present in the papers, and particularly, it has been used. Maybe you did, Andy, did you use it? Yes, you did. Yes, you did. No, it did, but I wonder whether any of you, which of course the scholarship of the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, which of course was a very impressive body of scholarship on the revolution, was created at that time, but it does strike me, do you believe that the Enlightenment or some kind of radical democratic or evangelical belief system was undermining imperial control somehow, or undermining the imperial stability, even if it's not, the question of control might be a little bit off of, what was the Enlightenment undermining the empire and imperial control, which of course is central, those three issues, the Enlightenment, radical democratic thought, and maybe evangelical Protestantism, those three ideological belief systems are central to the interpretations of 1960s, 1970s, 1980s in terms of the coming of the revolution and its shape. And yet, none of us have discussed that. So I'm curious, I mean, except for Andy. You know, no, in all seriousness, we're much more about, both the papers and our discussion is about contingency, it's about what's happening to personalities. But I just wonder your views, is that happening? Is the empire being undermined ideologically?
I'll take a crack first. You know, a guy who's not too far away from here, David Armitage, has, of course, famously said that the ideology of the British Empire is one that's Protestant, commercial, maritime, and free. And more or less, this kind of checks a number of the boxes that you're talking about. So the Enlightenment, is that something that's going to, is this kind of, these sets of thoughts going to tear down the empire? I think to a certain extent, yes. But at the same time, they also buttress the empire. And that's it. So they're all drawing from the same menu. So the reformers that I write about and talk about also are the people that are reading the same kinds of writers that Americans are going to be reading when they're going to be rebelling. So those sorts of things, it's like reading the Enlightenment's like reading the Bible. You know, you can find whatever you want, and even Satan can quote from the Bible. And I mean, that's one of the things about when you look at the Enlightenment. So the British state is premised upon notions of consent, and Americans will later be rebelling on those very same notions as well.
I mean, I hadn't thought about this before, but I think you could actually make a certain kind of argument that American resistance is a form of counter-Enlightenment activism in this particular sense. Patrick made the really important point a moment ago that the kinds of reforms, the kinds of policies, legislation the British government's putting in place in the 1760s has equivalence in the Portuguese world, in the Spanish world, in the French Empire. And these have been studied much more extensively now than they were in the 1960s and 1970s. And what becomes very clear is that British reform is a cousin of other types of imperial reform that are taking place. In a Latin American context, those are usually referred to as enlightened reforms, right? Various forms of enlightened absolutism where you have central governments trying to impose some order by working not out of a kind of a practical, you might say, idiosyncratic system that's solving particular issues, but have a more global sense of what it ought to look like. So in some ways, what the American rebellion is about, you could argue, is a response to that kind of version of administrative enlightenment. And let's just go keep the sort of the messy order that we've become used to. And to make that argument, we have to make certain kinds of arguments that have their own higher values. But I think it's important, you know, coming from slightly from outside of American history, I mean, there's a lot of the defense or the resistance to the British order, which is a resistance to innovation and a certain kind of modernization in defense of local privileges, customary rights, established practices.
I find it quite interesting that view of it, and I think that, of course, that turns on its head a lot of the scholarship from the earlier period, or at least sort of it channels it in a very different kind of direction, away from the sort of standing interpretation of that. I do think it's one of those issues that it really has changed how we're talking about it. The second issue I just wanted to, and which Patrick had touched upon, and was touched upon in one of the earlier panels, is one of the other aspects of that earlier scholarship was that one of the premises was, in some ways it touches on what Serena was talking about before, was explosive population growth and its impact on the paradigm of patriarchy. Because the colonial population was doubling every 20 years, or actually perhaps now in some decades, the population increase was faster than that. So you really have a kind of issue there. And of course, one whole school in the scholarship of the 1960s and 1970s was based materially, or social reality was rapid population growth undermined the imperial control and patriarchal control. Do you see that as still valid? That demographic expansion is a central aspect of destabilizing imperial control, or at least the order of British America, the imperial order of British America in terms of its social structure and its political order? Just again, does anyone have a response on that?
I mean, I feel that any comment I make is, again, at such a general level, and there are people in this room who, really have much, I think, much more concrete things to say about the ways in which pressure creates change. But I think that if we, if we think about the expansion of all of these places, right, of where people are living, of the, environmental impacts of expanding, all kinds of deforestation or other, other issues, or using extending crops and more monocrop culture. I do think that there are places that can't hold anymore, where there's just too many people, right? There's where the problem of sort of managing, for example, managing enslaved populations feels overwhelming to people, right? And then there are also places where those population shifts move. I'm sorry, this is not super helpful at all. Forgive me. But so I think what I'll say is that that yes, the number of bodies matters. Right? Why don't we say that? And that will make a difference. And so maybe I'll just say we know that as families get, not necessarily larger, but as they start working harder, right, as we move towards, say, an industrious revolution, that does have an impact on the ways in which people consume and the things that they care about, and then, therefore, their larger relationship to the empire. So I'm going to say those material factors matter, but clearly, I'm just going to spin myself into circles trying to talk about how.
Yeah. Patrick or Chris?
Yeah, I think the question that you have, and I think what Serena's answer to it, tells us how important the earlier 18th century was and the dynamism of that earlier 18th century. And it's not just the population growth, it's really a period of extraordinary movement. And of course, going back to things that Chris was just talking about too, when you think about other empires as well, it's not only happening in the North American case, say with the movement of sort of like German and Irish and then Scots across the ocean, those free migrants anyway, but it's happening in Brazil. It needed a much, much larger movement from Portugal to Brazil at the very same kind of moment. So various imperial powers are dealing with the same sorts of issues when it comes to population growth. And what you actually find, and this is kind of like the Brazilian case as well, is that there are fears that, if you will, that there's going to be a tilt in the imperial balance. And so at this particular period of time, people are exactly saying, they're pointing that out and saying with doubt, the center of the empire is eventually, of the British Empire, is going to be in North America, just because of the absolute guarantee that population is going to continue to explode there. And so this is causing people to radically begin to kind of reconceive about what are we going to do and how are we going to manage this. So I see this as, if you will, just again, another kind of manifestation of the many kind of tangled problems that people are dealing with at this time.
Yeah. It also ties to what Andy had said in the first session about Western facing and facing more towards a continental empire, and that does tie to it. Chris, do you want to come in on this?
I mean, I don't have a lot to add except that, I mean, when you take the sort of the demographic issues, the population issues, and then you throw in the migration, which, so that on the Brazilian side, it's not only folks moving from Portugal to Brazil, but also from coastal Brazil into the various hinterlands of Brazil. It does start to feel inevitable, which is to say independence. Because there's a kind of an independence of living and an experience which precedes the political independence, right? So it's hard not to think of it as, in one way or another, inescapable, in one form or fashion, a mode of independence that is not going to be, because in some ways the colonial period is a period in which colonizers can't be independent in one way or another, whether that's in terms of economically, whether it's in terms of militarily, whether it's because of their relationship, the character of their relationship with the indigenous populations that are already there. There's various reasons why they can't be independent, right? And then you get to that sort of, that metaphor of, infant to youth to adulthood to, getting out of the parents' house, right? Which is some version of what the independent stories are. So yeah, I do. I think the demography is definitely destiny for this history.
Yeah. Why don't we stop right then and open up the floor to questions? And I see Lige already has his hand up, so he's actually reading my mind. Yes, Lige's head is exploding. So let's get him in for a question.
So this is just a fabulous session. All four presentations, Brendan, you have a presentation as well. When I first saw the program, my immediate thought was, let's change could to should. Should the British Empire have been preserved? And I think, Chris, you in particular, spoke to that. So I'm going to reframe it. And I agree with everything you said, Chris. I guess the one thing I would say is that the British Empire that is just fine is not the empire that first Lord Bute and then George Grenville try to create. That empire lasts exactly 15 years, from 1763 to 1778, the Carlisle Peace Commission. And it's built around attempting to master this demographic transformation that you all have spoken. It's also built around the fact that a third of Britain's merchant marine is being built right here in the colonies, mainly in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And that terrifies the British. And I don't think they recover from this quite as quickly as your presentation suggested. They grapple with it. The 1780s are a critical period for Britain, no less than in the United States. And the way the British respond practically guarantees that there will have to be a constitutional convention. It destroys the Articles of Confederation. And, in some ways, you could actually say it's the American Constitution that makes that second British Empire, and we're not supposed to use that term, I know, possible. But I think when you ask, could the empire have been saved, it's really this integrated empire. It's an integrated nation. It's not clear if it's completing the Anglo-Scottish Union or if it's completing the restoration project of enfranchising the counties Palatinate of Durham and Lancaster, which is how other people talk about the taxation. But it's a very particular vision of empire, one that is obviously doomed to failure, and it actually produces American independence. But I think it's quite different from the empire that succeeds. And your fascinating comments about anti-slavery or the abolition of slavery, I think, really prove that.
Should I say something about? So, absolutely about the Bute-Grenville Empire. And I was being slightly facetious to try to make a broader point about where the future lay, in some ways, for both countries. The point that you make about the merchant marine is actually really crucial. And I will say that as somebody who lives in the British secondary literature more, that is not something which is discussed or talked about much at all. It's just how much that dependence on, especially New England personnel, as well as obviously the capacity to build ships and all of those kinds of things. So, but what I also think it points out is that there were a lot of different British empires. And both in terms of first, second, depending on sort of what your chronologies look like, but there's also a lot of different visions of what the empire is at any given moment. And Bute and Grenville's empire is actually not the empire that other folks in Parliament are on board with at different points. So it's a reminder about the plurality of things. I've often, I'll leave it there. There's just a lot of different empires that are active at once, and especially when you're concerned with what's in the mind, the imagination, the understanding of what is happening. Versus, those realities.
Yes, go ahead, Andy. Andy Shankman.
Yeah, I'll try to say. Yeah, it was just a quick follow-up on that. Because I think you could argue just as persuasively that the Butte-Grenville Empire is repudiated between 1764 and 1767. Right, and there's a very different vision of empire that then doesn't last, right? But this, just one brief thing. I think anyone here who hasn't read Mary Beth Morton's book 1774 needs to. It's amazing, but there's a little. But again, Mary Beth, don't get too excited because it's a book that said because I might not be the best person because it's a book that said exactly what I wanted it to say. So I might not be the fairest. Yeah, you love those kinds of books, and this is something that I would just say in response to Patrick, which is, to me, why it's 1774 and not 73 is because even 1773 and this gets back to what Chris was saying about innovation, doesn't force the colonists to change their view of what's wrong. Right? I mean, in 1768, very famously, it's Dickinson who says, this is an innovation, right? The most fundamentally conservative view you can have, right? You, Parliament, are the innovators. You're the revolutionaries. You're doing something different. He says, I've looked back at every statute, and nothing before 1765 bothers me, right? I'm fine with it. And indeed, he says, you can regulate us to prevent any kind of manufacturing, and that would be fine, right? It's what you're, and it's what they're saying, right? And as they're getting angry and worried about these innovation coming, there's still a solution that's within the empire. Go back to that. The difference between 73 and 74 is that the coercive acts are not taxes. That is legislation. And now they realize that's an even more dangerous power than taxation. Well, if you can't tax, and now you can't legislate, that's independence, right? And that's the break in consciousness that Mary Beth does such a good job of talking about. The only thing I would say to Elijah is we don't have to get there. We do get there. We're there. It happened. I mean, I'm not so crazy to say what didn't happen happened. I mean, I know it happened. Jack, I know the revolution did occur. I do care about it. But all I'm saying is, that there's a very, very complex story, and it's precisely because there's a brief moment, a period of time where people who are really powerful, as you say, people like Chatham, right? Who's bigger than him? Who have in fact repudiated and know why they need to repudiate the Grenville-Bute Empire and have done so. And that doesn't take, because yes, there is this robust variation of complex arguments about what the empire should be that's existing within British policymaking circles, and it's not monolithic.
Oh, if only Napoleon had a B-52. I mean, that's it. It comes back down to this question of contingency. So I would certainly agree with the thrust of what Lige just suggested, that you do have, before you have an empire of what you could call an empire of almost arrangements. There were various different constitutional arrangements, quasi-constitutional arrangements that holds the whole together. But ultimately, many people, the further you are away from the center, the more autonomy you have. The Scots and the Irish don't have much autonomy, but the further away, you do enjoy some autonomy. That changes for that period of time, and then you're going to have an empire later on, a successor empire, of course, that is going to be based, as Chris was saying, upon a Commonwealth sort of ideal. But the key is, what date are we going to fix on for that critical moment of time that Elijah just was talking about? And I think that we can get into all kinds of debates when it's going to be. My thing is not so much the particular reasons why they're going to push against. My thing, the point I was trying to make is there's a certain mindset I think that revolutionaries have. And that revolutionary mindset is one that's premised upon seeing history as a certain series of patterns in a certain sort of way. So then it means, like I was saying, 1773, you pass what is seemingly kind of an innocuous sort of thing that's going to benefit everyone and financially benefit many of the colonists as well, yet they still blow up. And that is because I think at that point they do the patterning. I think, like I was saying with Mary Beth's book, everything's just going to go to hell in a handbasket really quickly after that for the reasons, Andy, that you just mentioned. But I do think that something happens to their minds a little bit before then that begins to transform them a little bit. So those couple of ministries that Lige was laying out are really important for the way that Americans are going to see the world.
So we have time for one more question. Yeah, I know you've been so patient. Go ahead.
All right, two parts of the question. The first part is building the empire. The second part is the collapse of the empire. So the first question for Christopher, the second for Patrick. So if you mentioned Latin America, you said the British Empire, in terms of Americas, British Empire is fine. And I would argue Spanish Empire was fine too. But in the building America, empires in the Americas, Spanish Empire was built on revenge. In the 1492, after the reconquest of Moros, right, the Spanish, they become a kingdom. They want to, it's a revengeful act to start out, send people to Americas in order to build the empire, right? So that was not the impetus for British to build British Empire in North America, but there was the impetus for Spanish to build empires in South America, right? Mm-hmm. So the building, the foundational reasons are different to build empire, right?
Yeah.
Maybe, should I ask a second? I have a question to Patrick as well. So the collapse of empire, you mentioned the Creoles. role they played. And you also compare the Americas, the North and the South. South America, you have Simon Bolivar, which is a South American George Washington, right? San Martin is a South American Thomas Jefferson, right? So there's a pattern. Those founding fathers in South America, they're from a nobility, from a Spanish society. And then they become a state, economically, the hacenderos, which means owners of plantations, have slaves. And then they also got enlightenment, education in Europe, right? They know classics, they play piano, but they led the revolution to become independent. And then they emulated North American Constitution to construct the South American constitutions. And it becomes more than one country. Here, just one American country, right? So one is the building the empire. The other is a collective empire. How you compare South and the North.
That's pretty interesting.
There are so many different ways I could respond, and I was invoking comparisons largely to both clarify, well, hope to clarify, or at least provoke some thought about the British North American situation, and place it in the context of the broader British Empire. It's interesting, sort of comparative history as a methodology and as a project always runs into these questions of like with dislike. As historians, we're concerned with the particular rather than cases. There obviously is an age of revolutions, there's an age of independence, there's a whole pattern of Creole resistance and overthrow of European overlords. But I know enough to know that I don't have a strong enough view or knowledge to be able to sort of draw out those comparisons in the ways it might suggest. But I do think that, and this is one of my hopes for the coming 250th, whatever we call it, it is important for Americans to me, to keep a wide-angle lens on the coming of the revolution, of independence, and its aftermaths. Because there sometimes is a quality of not getting out much and not realizing that our nation's story is part of a much broader set of stories. And it's not just a matter of being sort of fair or acknowledging the rest of the world, but we can learn all kinds of things about the particularities of our history by investigating, exploring, coming to know how things worked out in roughly similar cases in very different ways. So, I mean, I've been hoping that one consequence of this anniversary is to really think about the international dimensions of the American independence, the American Revolution, in those moments. So, to me, your questions point to the beginning of conversations that really need to happen.
I think we're going to stop there. I really want to thank my three colleagues for what I thought was a fabulous discussion, and the audience for their fabulous questions. We will resume tomorrow morning.